Good afternoon and welcome to the 2021 Oregon Active Transportation Summit. My name is Erin Haley. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Communications Director with the Street Trust. Before we begin our program, the Street Trust would like to acknowledge the land we are occupying. The Portland metro area rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. We take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land. Thank you. Welcome to Human-Powered Mobility, Resiliency, and Equity. Your moderator for this session is Thuy, and your presenters are Kerry, Aszklar, Mauricio, LeClerc, Joey Posada, and Mike Serritella. You can type your questions in the chat or use the raise hand tool, both found at the bottom of your screen. Please use the social media hashtag OATS21 to post about the summit on social media. And don't forget to visit our website at thestreettrust.org to learn more about other programs and activities, including SB 395, aka Safe Routes for All, an update to the historic bike bill on its 50th anniversary that the Street Trust is championing in the Oregon legislature this session. To claim AICP credit for this attending session, please log into the OATS Sched platform and find the AICP certificate download link near the top of the page. Now, without further delay, please welcome to your screen, Thuy.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you. Hello. Nice to see everybody. I see some familiar faces and familiar names. And don't be shy, you can totally turn your camera on. Sometimes it's nice to see your face as well. I want to welcome you. I want to thank you first for joining us on this beautiful sunny afternoon where you could be anywhere else but behind your computer learning about resiliency, earthquakes, and human-powered mobility. So I want to thank you again for taking this time out of your schedule. As you know, this past year has really been a test of our resilience in many ways. Personal resilience, professional resilience, climate resilience, locally and nationally, and in so many different ways, even health resilience. So we are here to talk about transportation, but also the intersection of transportation and resiliency. And I want to share with you that we're taking the show on the road, so to speak. We have teamed up last fall in my class, which is the Portland Traffic and Transportation class, hosted by PBOT at PSU. And we did a run through with my students back in the fall. And to some degree, though, I think it was pretty well received. I think one of the big takeaway was we didn't even think about resiliency. We were not even thinking about earthquakes. And I want to be able to take this opportunity to kind of enlighten you, as well as to say that we ultimately can come together as a community for transportation and bring in equity as much as integrating and learning from all of us. Take a very collaborative and a multicultural collaborative perspective in how we plan for our communities. So Kerry, if you can cue up the slide, that would be great. And within this, I also have a few questions. I want to take a poll. Usually I do this in my classroom setting, but I can't see everybody. But we have 2 questions on the poll, and this is our intro. But if you could go to the second slide, which is the poll questions. And yes, if you can answer these questions, there will be 2 of them. And a big part of it is really to learn more about what projects you're working on, and also that are resiliency related, and also like in the future, what future projects you want to work on that you can integrate into your current projects. And the other question is more on a personal basis of, do you have an emergency kit at home? And so I'm taking it from a professional perspective of where you are in your world, and but also as a personal of like, are you yourself prepared? So let's go to the next slide. So the poll questions we'll be running through, if you can answer them, that would be great. And also at the beginning, feel free to put your questions in the chat. I want to make this as interactive as possible, especially since we're in a virtual setting. So some of the questions that I want you to think about during this talk is, what is resiliency? We talk about it. It's been a test of our resilience, personal resilience over the year, but really what is resilience? And what does resilience mean to you? These are all very different questions. Another thing you want to consider is, why is it important? Why do we have to think about resiliency? Important to you, important to your work, important to your agency if you work with an agency, and also how is it important to your clients, and how can you deliver projects and be intentional with your projects and make it as holistic as possible? Why are we doing this? And what are we doing? And how are we doing? So these are just some of the simple questions of why, how, who, when, where, but want to really have it in your mind as to the big takeaway from this is how to be able to somehow answer some of these questions as we enter into this conversation. So
before we move forward, I just wanted to give a quick update on the poll. Looks like a large majority of you have 0 or 1 to 3 projects in resiliency, and there's just a couple of you that are already working in resiliency. So that shows like our audience is, there's a lot of new creative minds here, and really exciting to open up that way forward.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Joey. That also creates a really good dialogue as to how we can work together. So I feel like as we're presenting this, there's also so much that we can also learn from the audience. So just a brief agenda. Kerry, next slide. I will be presenting a resiliency project and sort of unveiling it for the first time in a public setting. It's a project through our Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization in partnership with Metro to plan out and update our emergency transportation route. So I will be speaking on that project, and then at a very regional level. And then as we dial down into the next level, looking at citywide and our local city, Mauricio and Mike will talk about the initiatives that PBOT has been working on and unveiling some of their work at a city level. And then after that, Kerry and Joey will then share some of the community and neighborhood work that they have been engaged in during a PSU study. So, and after that, we'll open it up to Q&A. So the intent is to get us done by 2:30. What I understand is that the room doesn't close at 2:30. We'll still stay on after that. So do you have any, like I said, if you have any questions, put it in the chat. After each presentation, we'll answer some of the clarifying questions, but mainly after the bigger, all three, then we'll come together as a panel to address some of the questions and your concerns. Do you have any results from the second polling questions you want to share?
We're going to hold that one for when we get into the community presentation or the neighborhood one.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Thuy.
I do want to forewarn you that the presentation that I'm going to talk about in our emergency transportation route may be a little bit more technical than we need to be, but that's where most of the project lies right now. And we go to the next slide, I could kind of set the tone in our stage to talk about where we are, how are we going to retool this? So much of the work over the last few years, all these conferences I've attended, maybe 2 decades ago, never talked about resiliency or equity or integrating diversity or community as much as it is now. So one of the things in the forefront of Portland and everywhere else is there's such a paradigm or a mental shift that also needs to take place in order to retool some of our thinking and some of the way we interact at a transportation level, land use, urban planning, and ultimately bring it into like community and equity. So some of the defining characteristics, which I have shopped around with students in the architecture school, the planning school, and the engineering school, some of the things that have risen to the top as to what are the defining characteristics of community equity and resilience, these are the terms that have come to light. So I'd love to also give you an opportunity, since you're working in the field, to also engage with us and help us also kind of refine and retune how we plan for resiliency. So some of these are equity and social justice, very, very important. Sustainability, and also the triple bottom line. Complexity, understanding where you are in the context of where we are in the city, in the nation. Being an individual within the context of a community. These are really high, kind of like thinking out loud as to where we stand as a person, testing our own human resilience as we learn and take what we learn individually and then into the context of the community. And also integrating infrastructure development in this space. This is the land use and the transportation, the infrastructure builds, and then it builds for civils, for people. So that leads to the concept of livability and being able to create a community that is livable, but also deep down into the core is, what is your purpose and what is your passion? So I want to lay that out as kind of a framework before we move forward. And we'll also welcome some terms and any thoughts and feedback you have on that as well. So next slide. So woven throughout our talk, we have, like, again, a couple of really key terms that that's really critical, I think, as we enter into this the new paradigm, and also like, how do we make this happen for everybody, and how do we integrate more resiliency projects? So one of the things that was not mentioned, I think, in the previous slide, I want to come to light, is the commitment to our industry and also the commitment to ethics. So with that, I'm going to share my project, which is the planning out our emergency transportation route. If you can go to the next slide. So this project is in partnership with our regional disaster preparedness organization and Metro. There was a grant that came to be for a first phase to update our regional transportation route. And I'm working on this project with a team of folks, our resilience experts across the state, and also quite a bit of mapping that needs to be done for this. So what you'll see will be a series of maps that we are unveiling for the first time, kind of actually in a public setting, of where we are with planning out our emergency transportation route for the region. Like I said, one of the things is, because this is a regional project, what you'll see throughout the presentation is that there's so much at a community level. There's only so much at a community level that the region can take on. So that's why we have the follow-on with the city and also the local community efforts. So let's go to the next slide. Project timeline. I want to share some of the work that had come to be for here. We are almost near the end of phase 1. So we've developed best practices, did quite a bit of a data inventory to collect all the data from the 5 counties. And then we developed a methodology, as well as documenting all of this into a report. And ultimately, there will be a dissemination workshop that will take place June 2nd. So this presentation is like right in the middle of the end game of our work for phase 1. So next slide shares some of the updates. Why are we doing this update? We're looking at 5 counties and integrating most of the projects within the 5 counties. Next slide. And these are their stakeholders that were involved within this project. It's quite a big project and a lot of work in it. Next slide. I'm actually going to go through this really quickly because we are also going to move up to the next one. So what you'll get these slides later, and what you can see is Metro has a public online viewer that shows the transportation routes and the updates to the route. So you'll take a look. If you go on this website, you'll see where we are with our route resilience, our route connectivity, and then where we are with community and equity. And also in the website for RDPO is our report. Next slide. Definitions of ETRs. These are the definitions that came out of our work. And one of the big things is really the making it a regional ETR. Next slide. And our methodology. We came up with what we're doing in terms of revealing the existing ETR routes, taking it and then integrating connectivity and access. And also from that, we apply the methodology to integrate the route resilience and ultimately the community and equity. And then from that, we came up with our updated ETR routes. Next. So this is actually going to be the last slide I'm going to share because I want to open this up. I know I had a pretty big presentation in here, but for the interest of time and also like being able to have a discussion, I'm going to share this as my last slide to show you this is what we've put together for our emergency transportation route at a regional level. And these slides will be available to you, so you'll be able to click through and see all the others that I had put together. But in the interest of time, I also want to now hand over the floor to Mauricio and Mike so they can talk about what they're doing at a local level. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, let me just load up our presentation here.
All right, I'll start chatting while you do that. Mauricio LeClerc, City of Portland, Supervising Planner Area and Project Planning. With Mike, we in our team, we do corridor and area plans for the city and plan for major capital projects. So in one of the tasks that we've had in the last couple of years is to understand what the resiliency means for the City of Portland and the region and the state. You know, one of the things that I learned, I've also been participating in Thuy's process. There's a coordination effort. It goes from the state to the region, to the local, to the community. And it's very important to coordinate it. So I appreciate Metro's and Thuy's efforts to update those lines that were kind of getting outdated. Tillman Crossing, for example, was not there, and now it will be. Our idea here is that, let's advance this to the next, is we have been tasked to develop a resilience strategy for the City of Portland. What does that mean? So we start with a quick definition. Next slide. Is the ability of a community to mitigate the impacts, respond to the challenges, and recover in the face of a range of both natural and human generated challenges. And you can see in the background, people biking on a greenway to downtown. So next slide. The hypothesis we have is, among others, is that PVA, we see an opportunity to elevate the role of active transportation in transportation resiliency. This comes to us from some work that we've done over the years. We've hired great, very smart PSU students who helped us with research around the world. And one of the things we learned is that the cities, you know, imagine Japan, New Zealand, Chile, where I'm from, they have certain aspects of resiliency in their thinking in a way that we haven't yet. We are just, the region is, at least the city is just trying to get there. Our hypothesis comes from the fact that most of, looking at other cities, they basically don't say, let's stop everything and embrace resiliency. Rather, they bring resiliency into their work as a value added, just like we're bringing equity as a value added, a new thing that we want to advance. So for us, active transportation is it's the Portland way in many ways. So it also, so it's something we want to continue to embrace, but also we see a lot of opportunity to use resiliency as a new way of thinking, in which the active transportation is not just a way to reduce carbon emissions and, you know, make community better, but also a way to mitigate the impacts of climate change already taking place, such as escape route for fires, flooding, and so forth, ice, storms. So having a coherent, clear active transportation network will be vital for communities and for the city as a whole to respond, to prepare us for the big ones, but also to quickly recover. So that's our hypothesis. We're starting the work, so we don't quite have a strategy developed for you, but I think we can run you through what we've done so far, including what we've done during the COVID era. So next slide. Some of the thinking has evolved over the years. When we first started, and we're doing some of these capital projects, but the Erblumenauer Bridge started as a TSP project. As we began to map it out and make it real, we realized, hey, this could also be a great lifeline, because all the other bridges, the MLK, Grand Bridge, the 12 Bridge, will likely fall down in the case of an earthquake. So this is a value added, this Erblumenauer Bridge. It's a pedestrian bicycle bridge, but it also would provide an emergency response route in case of an emergency. Same with the Flanders Bridge, and the counties leading the region in the earthquake-ready Burnside Bridge. That is a larger conversation. So organically, the region has embraced resiliency. We just would need to formalize a little bit as we move forward and bring active transportation to it. This is a tangible example. You'll see it up and running pretty soon, I hope. Next slide. The city comprehensive plan, which guides the vision for the city, added resiliency as one of the big goals. So here's a kind of an introductory statement. Portland is a prosperous, healthy, equitable, and resilient city where everyone, this is the equity part, has access to opportunity and is engaged in shaping decisions that affect their lives. So now we have added policies that support this work. We at PBOT, you can advance to the next, are trying to operationalize. What does that mean for us moving forward? So next slide. I just talked about I think we mentioned the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. I come from Chile. People know that the big earthquakes happen. Here we do not. We have quite a deficient infrastructure because we never had to prepare for it. And the same is happening as the climate is changing, and we are likely to see more flooding, more fires, more ice, and so forth. So this is our chance to get ahead of that and try to mitigate the carbon emissions, but also react to changes that are to come. Next. And while we were preparing for that,
Mauricio, really quickly, before you jump into the next slide, we have a question about if PBOT has a date for the completion and installation of the Blumenauer Bridge.
I do. I don't have it top of my head. I'll get back to you as soon as I'm off talking. I can do a little research for you. So basically, as we were thinking about this, COVID happens. So basically, we've been living a resiliency test, and that we want to let you know what's happened very quickly, and then what are the lessons that we're taking into the continued work that we're going to do. And for that, I'm going to pass it on to Mike and begin to do a little bit of research because I want to give you the exact date. Thank you. So Mike.
Great. Thank you, Mauricio. Yeah, we had, as Mauricio mentioned, we had this sort of evolving thinking, growing thinking about resiliency. And we were scoped to really kick off this strategy effort in February of 2020. And so just as we were about to really kind of commit ourselves to fleshing out what this means for our city, we got, the COVID pandemic begun, and it kind of caught us off guard. It was, a major disruption in the personal and professional and city and everybody's life kind of stopped that day, or those first couple of weeks of March. And what we found was that through our responding to this kind of unknown, unprecedented crisis, we had our eyes on seismic, on flooding, on landslide, on these sort of major natural events. We were able to kind of, in the process of responding to COVID, develop some strategies and some response techniques that I think, kind of shined a brighter light on how we could approach the idea of resiliency moving forward. So if you were in an earlier meeting, an earlier speaking session this morning, you heard me and some other PBOT planners talk about our Safe Streets initiative. This is the sort of brand for our umbrella program for responding to the COVID-19 crisis. in this first year, we've really been focusing on how to support and adapt, and respond to the challenge of physical distancing in a city and a transportation system that was not necessarily designed to do that. And in that, there are the three sort of main program areas of the work. Our Slow Streets program, which is a network of calm, safe, local street routes for people to meet their daily transportation needs while walking, rolling, or biking. Kind of that human mobility network, human-powered mobility network. Our Safer Busy Streets program, which is about kind of rapidly deploying extra space for people in built environments that were not designed to support the kind of, or conform to the needs of physical distancing. And then our Healthy Businesses program, which was a sort of a rapid reimagining of the rights of way in our commercial and business district to support our businesses and our communities in adapting to this crisis. For this particular presentation, I'm really just going to focus on the slow streets and the healthy businesses, because that's kind of the most direct connection in terms of seeding the and shaping the way that we think about resiliency as we reapproach this task. So for the Slow Streets network, we were able to build off our existing neighborhood greenway network of over 100 miles of calm local streets, and really rapidly deploy signage and treatments so that folks could meet their basic needs, going to the park, going to the grocery store, accessing basic needs in their community. And it's played a major role in our COVID response. We see that this sort of community neighborhood resiliency networks could be helpful across a variety of different challenges as people adapt to the kind of long tail of recovery after any kind of major event. Our Healthy Businesses program really focused on retooling our streets and public rights of way to help support our businesses. We didn't, before there was, COVID, we never knew about the need for street plazas, rapid deployment of that. We built a program rapidly and expanded it citywide to do so. And the idea that streets are flexible public spaces and that we can change them and we can adapt them to respond to the different needs of a resiliency related challenge is something that we'll carry forward in thinking about these. So in this particular context, it was about, making sure restaurants and small businesses could operate outdoors. But in a different context, you can easily imagine a repurposing of streets to support things like medical distribution, food distribution, and other things like that. And the kind of last bit that I want to touch on is something that was piloted as part of our Safe Streets initiative, but we'll kind of continue with the Bureau, is our Frontline community partnerships. And in short, this was a way for us to rapidly contract with trusted community-based organizations to reach those who are most impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. These relationships forged through this program and this kind of ongoing commitment to deepening these relationships with community-based organizations is going to be important regardless of the resiliency challenge that we face ahead. When we think about equity and we think about impacts of different challenges in our system, we know that those who are most vulnerable and those who are most hard to reach are going to bear the front or bear the kind of the major impacts of any challenge. And so by the city deepening these relationships, we'll be able to do better outreach, better equity work, and reach those who are most impacted by any challenge. So we'd like to carry these three things, these three ways of thinking forward as we reapproach resiliency and as part of a formal work plan. So yeah, just a couple bullet point lessons learned, leading with equity, recognizing that any types of crisis will exacerbate existing disparities, leaning on those community partnerships and prioritizing those who are most vulnerable in our deployment of resources and strategic thinking, to embrace active transportation as a serious resiliency transportation strategy. We know that, disruptions to the grid or fuel systems or other structures means that we need something that can be powered by human bodies in terms of meeting their basic needs. And so we've done a great job over the past several decades embracing active transportation for a climate reduction strategy and for mode split and for all the great things that it is kind of brought to the city of Portland. And so it's about adding resiliency to that way of thinking. And to be, kind of to touch on these last two is just to be nimble and be adaptable. So, a simple solution that can be delivered quickly and in a responsive way is often better than a kind of complex response. And so having these systems ready to go, having trials and practice rapidly deploying responsive kind of infrastructure or investments, it's going to help us across a variety of challenges. And so as we are kind of at this inflection point, looking at the light at the end of the tunnel, we know that COVID may not be with us forever, but the lessons learned through this year of experimentation and adaptation can kind of stay with us as we reapproach thinking about resiliency. We wanted to expand our hazards, right? So initially really focused on seismic. COVID was a really good reminder that resiliency challenges come in all shapes and sizes, and the ones that we aren't expecting are often the ones that will, you know, kind of present us with the greatest challenge. So thinking about snow, thinking about flooding, thinking about landslides, and just thinking about the entire universe of human-related resiliency challenges, whether that be wildfire smoke, which is, you know, becoming an annual challenge for us here in Portland. A lot of the prior thinking as we, you know, were initially jumping into this was really about that kind of near-term response period. So this diagram shows the kind of arc of different phases of disaster response. There's this prepare and invest, kind of leading up to a disaster event, a kind of acute event. And then these waves that follow, the sort of short-term needs around response, and then the sort of midterm and longer term kind of long tails of recovery. Thinking about where PBOT is best positioned to influence and make a big difference, we see a huge role for us in the world of preparing and investing in our system so that it can mitigate those impacts and we are more kind of flexible in the face of a major challenge. But then also, you know, thinking about after the dust is settled, how do we recover to a better place? How do we help speed that recovery for those who are impacted? And really, again, just sort of leading with equity, recognizing that those who are most vulnerable and who may lack access to resources will bear the disproportionate impacts of any resiliency challenge. And by centering the kind of needs of those most impacted, we'll be able to mitigate for larger systemic forces and help kind of everyone across the board. And thinking about equity-related impacts to both natural and human-generated challenges kind of at all levels, from food systems to health, mental health, access to critical resources, and so on. As Thuy has kind of referenced, you know, this work happens at multiple scales: regional regional networks of response routes, citywide strategies, and also community-based resiliency. And that these are, while kind of separate considerations, need to have feedback loops and interact with one another. Mauricio, I don't know if you want to jump in and talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done today and kind of where our current thinking is moving forward.
Sure. Very quickly, we have done an assessment of all of our bridges. And lo and behold, only 4 do not need seismic retrofit. Don't be too scared. Hopefully, the big one doesn't come for a while, but it's a wake-up call, right? It would be a 750 million, so to speak, program to bring them up. Our idea is, how can we prioritize them? How can we make sure that we do not leave islands behind, you know, people who will be cut off from the rest of society? And how do we, and as we invest in bridge replacement, this is an example. There are other tools that address resiliency. How can we make sure that the active transportation network is on par and is being upgraded as well as we are investing in asset management and taking care of our network, our bridges in this case, you know. So we're doing some of this technical analysis, both to identify our needs, but also what would be a coherent, inclusive, and multimodal network to address it. If you go to the Metro website that Thuy has sent, you'll see a lot of the collectors, you know, because we're talking about emergency response coming from the states and big trucks and stuff. I think what we think we need to do is to supplement this with a more local ETR, emergency transportation routes that get you to your final destination, to the school, to the hospital, to the park, to wherever food distribution may be happening at the local network. You know, so that's where we're headed. You know, and right.
Mm-hmm.
give it back to you.
Yeah, and just to close this out and transition to that neighborhood community scale where Joey and Kerry are going to pick up the baton and keep going. Really, this experience of the last year with our Safe Streets initiative has really kind of re-emphasized and centered the role of human-powered mobility and creating resilient transportation networks and investments. So, you know, it's something that PBOT has done for decades, and we're good at it, I think. And it's something that we should really embrace as we think about resiliency. And just lastly, to close out, and Joey and Kerry can go into much more detail about what this actually looks like on the ground. They did an incredible project for us that they'll be speaking to, but that at all levels, we really need to center equity and deepen our partnerships with our trusted community-based organizations to help support and understand the needs of our community and build more resilient neighborhoods throughout the city. And so I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much. I'm excited about the Q&A at the end. And I'm gonna transition it back to Kerry and Joey to take it out from here.
Cool. Thank you, Mike. As he mentioned, we're going to transition to the neighborhood level and talk also about not just what neighborhood resiliency means, but also what community resiliency means, acknowledging that they are two separate things. But first, before I move on, Joey, would you be able to bring that poll back? Great. So we just want to know if you have an emergency kit at home. So we'll give it a few more seconds. I see some answers coming in. Great. It looks like a lot of folks have submitted their answers, and I'm kind of surprised. A lot of folks, or a third of folks have one that's fully stocked, and some have a small one, but some are planning on assembling one. So really awesome, cool. Thanks for engaging with that. Cool. Well, yeah, we are going to talk a little bit more about neighborhood resiliency and community resiliency. And I just want to start off and say that it's really important to be considering resiliency on the smaller neighborhood scale. Neighborhoods have really unique environmental and transportation characteristics that really impact how people travel and how they're going to access resources and reconnect with their families and all that stuff after a disaster. And as Mike and Mauricio alluded to, this is something that Joey, myself, and a group of graduate students at PSU explored with PBOT back in 2019. We called this the Ready Streets Project. And with this project, we focused on the neighborhood level during the recovery phase, which is about 2 to 30 days after a disaster. So not immediate, but once we start recovering from it. As PBOT mentioned, there's a lot of situations out there, but we decided to focus on an earthquake scenario. And our goals for this project were to explore the neighborhood level of resiliency and identify destinations and how people will access them, as well as what PBOT's role in creating this access will be. So for the Ready Streets project, we focused on the neighborhoods of Park Rose and Arguay. And we also did an existing conditions evaluation, such as what does the road network look like, the demographics and what community assets are there. And we also engaged with communities that lived there, but also communities that did not live there, but still had some sort of connection. And we also did an assessment of risks in the area. If you're not familiar with Park Rose and Arguay, you can see on the left side of the screen there, in the tiny black box there, they're essentially, as you look at the right side, they're essentially at the crux of the non-seismically resilient I-205 and I-84. which in an earthquake will collapse and cut off these neighborhoods, creating that island effect. And you can see at a high level that the road network within these neighborhoods is not very well connected and not really conducive to human-powered mobility, such as walking or biking. For the roads that are really well connected, they tend to be pretty auto-centric, such as Northeast 102nd and 122nd. Looking at the demographics of who lives there, the neighborhoods of Parkrose and Argay have a higher concentration of limited English proficiency households than the rest of Portland, as well as a larger percentage of people of color or Latinx households. I'll also add that there are pockets of low-income census block groups within these neighborhoods. Looking at hazards, we found that there was a pretty large chunk of these neighborhoods that were located in a liquefaction zone, which means that a lot of buildings will collapse during an earthquake. And north of these neighborhoods was a FEMA flood area zone, which will mean if there's an impact, or if there is a tsunami after the earthquake, they will be highly impacted. So all of this to say is that these two neighborhoods and the people living there will be disproportionately impacted by a large earthquake. So as we engage with communities about this, we focus not just on reaching out to neighborhood residents, but also to communities who don't live there, but still have some sort of connection there. And I think that this is really important because a lot of communities these days really are not bound to neighborhood boundaries. For instance, there's a large Buddhist temple in Parkrose where a lot of people of Laotian descent will gather from all around the region to worship. And those relationships and community ties are going to be really important during the recovery after an earthquake. As we engage with communities, we ask them essentially what places in this neighborhood are important to you, or where would you go, or what would you do? And what we found from these community conversations on the left side of the screen is that we had these 5 themes that I don't have time to go through all of them, but I do want to highlight 2 of them. One is to be self-sufficient through education and communication, and the other is equitable access to resources. These themes emerge because these communities know, after a long history of inequities and broken relationships with institutions, they know that they can't wait for the government to rescue them. And knowing that these communities wanted that more information and that access to resources so that they could be self-sufficient and they could help themselves and their communities when the time comes. And before I pass it to Joey, I just want to highlight this quote from a Parkrose High School student saying, "In our community, a lot of people are struggling even without the earthquake." Thanks, and I'll pass it on to Joey.
Thanks, Kerry. As we go into the next slide, a really big component of what came out of our research, as Kerry was saying, is like the community resilience aspect. Before I jump into some of the recommendations that community resiliency was at the center of, I wanted to define it really quickly as the sustained ability of a community to withstand and recover from adversity. So going into the next slide, we have 4 recommendations that we had shared from our research. And under these, there was several more like descriptive objectives and things that we shared with PBOT. But just giving you a taste, we talked about increasing capacity and capability of a community, delegating local decision-making power, resilient physical infrastructure, and diversifying uses of the network, the transportation network. But just wanting to emphasize that community resiliency is as important, if not more important, than transportation infrastructure. Like Kerry was saying, we like the self-sufficiency element and access to needs, those are really key components for the local level and for especially like underrepresented communities, marginalized communities. Equity is a really important factor here. So as we go into the next slide, and I'm just going through these really quickly because I want to give space for all of you to ask questions. But the next slide just shows a little graphic really quickly of like how community resiliency is conducted, I guess. And a part of that is like emergency preparedness, but also like community well-being. So we looked at centering like land use development, reducing potential barriers to basic needs and services. This includes like food, medical care, community centers and libraries. A part of like the resiliency pieces to help share information and communicate with communities that are underrepresented for them to understand like what to be prepared for and how to just get those basic needs met. And then also focusing on walkable neighborhoods. We want, like Kerry was showing a couple of the maps that we were working with, and there's a lot of resources that aren't in reach to a lot of these communities outside of driving. So making these resources more available and walkable. And if there is a disaster like an earthquake, then they don't have to travel too far to get to these resources. And another element is decision-making power, talking about the community being a little bit more, or figuring out how to collaborate and involve these different community groups, and thinking about upstream planning and development, land use development to reduce potential barriers, such as the collapsed highways and waterways, and seeing how they can like reduce or improve the access to those. And I feel like this is kind of repetitive. So just jumping into the next slide, the community resiliency, our infrastructure is going to support equitable outcomes and generate sustainability, because we're really like investing in these networks that already are in place and figuring out how we can uplift and elevate these different groups and communities. And I guess like one high level note from this is, you know, we want to elevate that informal and the formal networks of resiliency, you know, like at the government level, but then also like grassroots community level, and how we all come together to make that a possibility. So like the overall strategy is collaboration, like what Mike was saying, it's going to be an iterative process, and it's a cycle, it's a holistic approach. So just closing out, going into my next slide, you know, bringing it full circle, there's a lot of different levels that resiliency comes into play. And it is going to be important to think about that human-centered work in each of these levels. Why are communities at the foundation of this work? And we're trying to embed equity into a lot of our processes. Every process should have equity as a center of our work, and really challenging ourselves to define what that means and open that up. So that's just like emphasizing that priority of the human-centered work. And I want to open it up now to the Q&A section, just to kind of get the conversation started, unless there's like any big questions in the chat. I don't think I see any big questions. So I'm just gonna ask some of our panelists, just to get that conversation started. Why is human-centered work important, and how does it benefit marginalized communities?
To us?
Yeah.
Well, communities is the basis of Portland. You know, it's based on 90 neighborhoods. And at this point, when we were starting the resiliency work, we were reminded by somebody that works at POEM, you know, or the city's official emergency response bureau, that during Katrina, it was not the government that pulled out neighbors. Most of them were pulled out by their neighbor, next door neighbors. So it is foundational that folks themselves help one another, but also as experts of their community, they need to tell us what is needed. And we need to somehow create a continuum from the region and state, you know, all the way to a community, to all communities, hopefully, so that everybody can be taken care of as quickly as possible an event were to occur. Secondly, how to prepare for such a thing is such an important aspect of it. That is both us preparing with better connection, better bridges, whatever, better active transportation network, but also the community itself needs to get ready, starting at the household, like you said, with emergency kits, but also make sure that you have a strong community can support one another. But that could be a quick answer.
I'll jump in really quickly. I like that you brought up Katrina, because I think that we can learn a lot from Katrina. And one of the big lessons learned that I've learned from Katrina was how communities, like I keep saying, how they really do come together. And if you have a time over the weekend, a really good movie you can check out is called The Villages of Versailles, which came out as a result of the Vietnamese community coming together to really harness and take care of each other during the time of Katrina. So that's usually a movie recommendation I bring up, but it's also a really huge lessons learned, especially as we enter into the climate mitigation and climate resiliency. We're seeing so many different types of catastrophes, for lack of a better word, that's happening with wildfires and things that's happening. So it's becoming more and more of a norm, but how do we as individuals and within our community take care of each other? So before we move into the next question, Joey, there is something in the chat and it came from Armando. So he had asked, are there emergency elements that include cargo bikes? Previously, FEMA came to PDX to talk about it. So in any event, there is a question in the chat. I don't know if we want to address that or not. But I think what Armando had mentioned is cargo bikes, wanting each of that within the fire station. That would be quite an idea.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I would add that I remember being in conversations where we were trying to put certain diverters, and things that would block the passage of cars. And some of the people who produce cargo bikes said, "You're making them too tight, man. We need to get through." So it is something that is very important, and it should be something that we incorporate into our work as we making a active transportation network. That is a great idea. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to open up. I know we have a few minutes left, and I just want to see if there's any other questions. Feel free to type them in the chat, or if you want to unmute, feel free to jump in. Kerry, do you mind unsharing maybe so we can see all the people in the audience?
So we do have another 5 minutes. I'm actually really curious to see the show of hands, or however, like, did this create some sort of enlightenment in some of the work, or professionally or personally, that you're going to be out there like this weekend going, I need to get an emergency kit? Or I need to send an email to my legislature to say we need more funding for this kind of work.
I see a couple of responses in chat. Somebody did respond saying yes, that it is inspiring to hear these presentations. And then there's a question, can you all identify potential funding sources for some of this work?
Great question. I hope that somebody inspired me. Actually, it was not, and we hope to inspire others. And somebody in the community inspired us to put it into our comprehensive plan. And now we need to operationalize it. It is real. The earthquake will happen sometime, hopefully many decades from now. Flooding is taking place, ice, so it should be part of our profession. I've been watching and kind of champion this from internally at Peabody, but there's a movement. There's a resiliency planning evolving, like environmental planning kind of evolved in the 70s. So hopefully the government, the federal government, the local state government will be able to provide funding for it. And I'm always thinking about grant opportunities. For example, as we apply for, let's say, Metro for a bridge, a resilient bridge is a more expensive bridge, more seismically firm. So it could be at a competitive disadvantage if we just send up that bridge. But if we were able to get some points for checking the box for resiliency, right? In actual transportation and this and that. I think it would begin to help reframe the discussion of funding at the region, not just for planning purposes, but also to build a network over time. That would be something that would be great that we could advance here at the metro and the state level. And also I understand the federal government is using resiliency as a lens as to distribute funding. So hopefully that has legs as well. So maybe that provides a great opportunity in the next few months, actually.
Yeah, I'll add on to that a little bit. It feels like we're kind of on the precipice of some kind of moment or zeitgeist around resiliency thinking and investing in our system. You know, the big infrastructure package outlined by the Biden administration really focuses on state of good repair, you know, repairing our bridges, not building necessarily new things or, you know, things that can kind of work, you know, fulfill many different kind of goals at the same time. So if there is a bridge replacement that's needed, making sure that that bridge has the right transit infrastructure, the right walking and biking infrastructure, so that yes, it can be, it can serve the resiliency of an earthquake scenario, but then it also can play a much longer term role in sort of the climate mitigation and promoting low carbon modes, and it's sort of through another level, another lens of resiliency. So I'm pretty hopeful that as this field continues to kind of crystallize and get more specific about what it needs, that it's actually will be a very competitive kind of narrative for going after grants and investments.
May I add 10 seconds? Don't wait for the grant to start. We basically, like what we said in the beginning, embed it into the work that you do. Start small, let it grow, you know, create a movement in a way, you know, starts with one person, people talking, getting a little bit more budget for this, asking the right questions, right? What about resiliency? What about if, you know, there was a mess last time, it was a bunch of ice here. Are we gonna just leave it alone? You know? And you know, that can generate internal conversations, so that can open up a new window of exploration. You know? So start small, but start, you know.
A pretty important question I want to bring up. I know that we are at time, but I had a really good call this morning with Ride Connection and trying to bring rides to our vulnerable communities. And Serenity, I want to mention that I did listen to the session that you were on yesterday or the day before, all kind of comes together. And I was really inspired in the work that you're doing. And you did ask a question with disability. And I would love to have a conversation with you about that, because I think it's so very important at so many levels. And yes, it has to be considered, and we need to figure out a way to make it happen. So I'd love to share a conversation with you to see how we can do better.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we had a few good questions that we didn't get to, but I included our contact information in the chat. So if anybody has any direct questions, like there was a really good question about, you know, if people with disabilities are being considered for this work. So, you know, just feel free to contact us and we'll be sharing the slides. And if there's any other things that come up, please feel free. We're friendly people and we like to chat and inspire. All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Thuy, Kerry, Mauricio, Joey, and Mike. Thank you to our sponsors listed on the SCED conference website. And thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of the OATS21 Summit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.